Hello and welcome to the Conquest of Bread by Peter Kopternik. Chapter 1: Our Riches. The human race has traveled a long way since those remote ages when men fashioned their rude implements of flint and lived on the precarious spoils of hunting, leaving to their children of their only heritage a shelter beneath the rocks, some poor utensils, and nature, vast, unknown, and terrific, with whom they had fight for their wretched existence. During the long succession of agitated ages which have elapsed since, mankind nevertheless amassed untold treasures. It has cleared the land, dried the marshes, honed the forests, made roads, pierced mountains. It has been building, inventing, observing, reasoning. It has created complex machinery, wrested her secrets from nature, and finally pressed steam and electricity into its service. And the result is that now the child of civilized man finds at its birth, ready for its use, an immense capital accumulated by those who have gone before him. And this capital enables man to acquire merely by his own labor combined with the labor of others, riches surpassing the dreams of the fairy tales of the thousand of and one nights. The soil is cleared to a great extent, fit for the reception of the best seeds, ready to give the return of the skill and labor spent upon it, a return more than sufficient for all the wants of humanity. The methods of rational cultivation are known. On the wide prairies of America, each 100 men, with the aid of powerful machinery, can produce in a few months enough wheat to maintain 10,000 people for a whole year. Where man wishes to double his produce, to treble it, to multiply into it a hundredfold, he makes the soil, gives to each plant the requisite care, and thus obtains enormous returns. While the hunter of old had to scour 50 or 60 square miles to find food for his family, the civilized man supports his household with far less pains and far more certainty on a thousandth part of that space. Climate is no longer an obstacle. When the sun fails, man replaces it by artificial heat, and we see the coming of a time when artificial light also will be used to stimulate vegetation. Meanwhile, by the use of glass, the hot water pipes, man renders a given space 10 and 50 times more productive than it was in its natural state. The prodigies accomplished in industry are still more striking. With the cooperation of those intelligent beings, modern machines themselves, the fruit of 3 or 4 generations of inventors, mostly unknown, 100 men manufacture now the stuff to provide 10,000 persons with clothing for 2 years. In well-managed coal mines, the labor of 100 miners furnishes each year enough fuel to warm 10,000 families under an inclement sky. And we have lately witnessed the spectacle of wonderful cities springing up in a few months for international exhibitions, without interrupting the slightest degree the regular work of the nations. And if in manufactures, as in agriculture, and as indeed through our whole social system, the labor, the discoveries, the inventions of our ancestors profit chiefly the few, it is nonetheless certain that mankind in general, aided by the creatures of steel and iron which it already possesses, could already procure an existence of wealth and ease for everyone of its members. Truly, we are far richer than we think. Rich in what we already possess, richer still in the possibilities of production of our actual mechanical outfit, riches of all in what we win from our soil, from our manufacturers, from our science, from our technical knowledge, were they but applied to bring about the well-being of all. 2. Our civilized societies, we are rich. Why then are many poor? Why is this painful drudgery for the masses? Why, even for the best paid workmen, this uncertainty for the morrow, in the midst of all the wealth inherited from the past, and in spite of the powerful means of production, which could ensure comfort to all in return for a few hours of daily toil? The socialists have said it and repeated it unwearingly. Daily they reiterate it, demonstrate it, by arguments taken from all the sciences. It's because all that is necessary for production, the land, the mines, the highways, machinery, food, shelter, education, knowledge, all have been seized by the few in the course of that long story of robbery, enforced migration and wars, of ignorance and oppression, which has been the life of the human race before it had learned to subdue the forces of nature. It is because, taking advantage of alleged rights acquired in the past, a few appropriate today 2/3 of the products of human labor, and then squander them in the most stupid and shameful way. It is because, having reduced the masses to a point at which they have not the means of subsistence for a month or even a week in advance, if you can allow the many to work only on the condition of themselves receiving the lion's share, it is because these few prevent the remainder of men from producing the things they need, and force them to produce not the necessities of life for all, but whatever offer the greatest profits to the monopolists. And this is the substance of all socialism. Take indeed a civilized country. The forests in which once covered it have been cleared, the marshes drained, the climate improved, it has been made habitable. The soil, which bore formerly only a coarse vegetation, is covered today with rich harvests. The rock walls in the valleys are laid out in terraces and covered with vines. The wild plants, which yielded not but acrid berries or uneatable roots, have been transformed by generations of culture in succulent vegetables or trees covered with delicious fruits. Thousands of highways and railroads furrow the earth and pierce the mountains. The shriek of the engine is heard in the wild gorges of the Alps, the Caucasus, and the Himalayas. The rivers have been made navigable. Artificial harbors, laboriously dug out and protected against the fury of the sea, afford shelter to the ships. Deep shafts have been sunk into the rocks. Labyrinths of underground galleries have been dug out where coal may be raised or minerals extracted. At the crossing of the highways, great cities have sprung up, and within their borders all the treasures of industry, science, and art have been accumulated. Whole generations that lived and died in misery, oppressed, all ill-treated by their masters, and worn out by toil, have handed on this immense inheritance of our century. For thousands of years, millions of men have been labored to clear the forests, to drain marshes, and to open up highways by land and water. Every root of soil we cultivate in Europe has been watered by the sweat of several races of men. Every acre has its own story of enforced labor, of intolerable toil, of the people's suffering. Every mile of railway, every yard of tunnel has received its share of human blood. The shafts of the mine still bear their rocky walls, the marks made by the pick of the workmen who toiled to excavate them. The space between each prop in the underground galleries might be marked as a miner's grave, and who can tell that each of these graves had costs in tears and privations and unspeakable wretchedness to the family who depended on the sanctity wage of the worker cut off in his prime by fire, damp, rockfall, or flood. The cities bound together by railroads and waterways are organisms which are lived through centuries. Dig beneath them and you find one above another, the foundations of streets, of houses, of theaters, of public buildings. Search into their history and you will see how the civilization of the town, its industry, its special characteristics have slowly grown and ripened through the cooperation of generations of its inhabitants before it could become what it is today. And even today, the value of each dwelling, factory, and warehouse, which has been created by the accumulated labor in the millions of workers now dead and buried, it's only maintained by the very presence of labor of legions of men whom now inhabit that special corner of the globe. Each of the atoms composing that we call the wealth of nations owes its value to the fact that it is part of a great whole. Would a London dockyard or a great Paris warehouse be if they not situated in these great centers of international commerce? What would become of our mines, our factories, our workshops, our railways, without the immense quantities of merchandise transported every day by sea or land? Millions of human beings have labored to create the civilization on which we pride ourselves today. Our millions scattered through the globe labored to maintain. Without them, nothing would be left in 50 years but ruins. There is not even a thought or an invention which is not common property. Born of the past and the present, thousands of inventors, known and unknown, who have died in property, have cooperated in the invention of each of these machines which embody the genius of man. Thousands of writers, poets, of scholars have labored to increase knowledge, to dissipate error, and to create that atmosphere of scientific thought without which the marvels of our century could never have appeared. And these thousands of philosophers, of poets, of scholars, and inventors have themselves been supported by the labor of past centuries. They have been upheld and nourished through life, both physically and mentally, by legions of workers and craftsmen of all sorts. They have drawn their motive force from the environment. The genius of Seguin, a mayor, a grove, has certainly done more to launch industry to directions than all the capitalists in the world. But men of genius are themselves the children of industry, as well as of science, not until thousands of steam engines have been working for years before all eyes, constantly transforming heat into dynamic forces and force into sound, light into electricity. Could the insight of genius proclaim the mechanical origin of the unity of the physical forces? And if we, children of the 19th century, have at least grasped this idea, if we know now how to apply it, it is again because our daily experience has prepared the way. The thinkers of the 18th century saw and declared it, but the idea remained undeveloped because the 18th century had not grown up like ours. Side by side with the steam engine, imagine the decades that might have passed while we remained in ignorance of this law, which has revolutionized modern industry and had Watt not found at Soho skilled workmen to embody his ideas in metal, bringing all the parts of his engine to perfection, so that steam pent in a complete mechanism and rendered docile than a horse, more manageable than water, became at last the very soul of modern industry. Every machine has had the same history. a long record of sleepless nights and of poverty, of disillusion, and of joys, of partial improvements discovered by several generations of nameless workers who have added to the original invention these little nothings without which the most fertile idea would remain fruitless. More than that, every new invention is a synthesis, the resultant of innumerable inventions which have preceded it in the vast field of mechanics and industry. Science and industry, knowledge and application, discovery and practical realization leading to new discoveries, cunning of brain of hand, toil of mind and muscle, all work together. Each discovery, each advance, each increase in the sum of human riches owes its being to the physical and mental travail of the past and the present. By what right, then, can any one, whatever appropriate the least morsel of this immense whole and say, "This is mine, not yours"? It has come about, however, in the course of the ages traversed by the human race, that all that enables man to produce and to increase his power of production has been seized by the few. Some time, perhaps, we will relate how this came to pass. For the present, let it suffice to state the fact that analyze its consequences. Today, the soil will actually owe its value to the needs of an ever-increasing population, belongs to a minority who prevent the people from cultivating it or do not allow them to cultivate it. According to modern methods, the mines they represent the labor of several generations and derive the sole value of the requirements of the industry of a nation and the density of the population. The mines also belong to the few, and these few restrict the output of coal or to prevent it entirely if they find more profitable investments of the capital. Machinery, too, has become the exclusive property of the few, and even when a machine incontestably represents the improvements added to the original rough invention by 3 or 4 generations of workers, it nonetheless belongs to a few owners. And if the descendants of the very inventor who constructed the first machine for lace making a century ago were to present themselves today in a lace factory at Bale or Nottingham and claim their rights, that would be told, "Hands off, this machinery is not yours," and they would be shot down if they attempted to take possession of it. The railways, which would be useless as so much old iron without the teeming population of Europe, its industry, its commerce, and its marts, belong to a few shareholders, ignorant perhaps of their whereabouts of the lines of rails which yield them revenues greater than those of medieval kings. And if the children of those who perished by thousands while excavating the railways, cutting and tunnels were to assemble one day, crowding in their rags and hunger to demand bread, and from the shareholders they would be met with bayonets and grape shots to disperse them and safeguard, quote, vested interests. In virtue of this monstrous system, the son of the worker, on entering life, finds no field which the man till, no machine which he may tend, no mine in which he may dig, without accepting to leave a great part of what he will produce to a master. He must sell his labor for a scant and uncertain wage. His father and his grandfather have toiled to drain this field, to build this mill, to perfect this machine. They gave to the work the full measure of their strength, and what more could they give? But their heir comes into the world poorer than the lowest savage. If he obtains leave to till the fields, it is not on condition of surrendering a quarter of the produce to his master, another quarter to the government and the middleman, and this tax levied upon by the state, the capitalist, the lord of the manor, and the middleman, is always increasing. It rarely leaves him the power to improve his system of culture. If he turns to industry, he is always he is allowed to work through, not always, even that, only on condition that he yield a half or 2/3 of the product to them whom the land recognizes as the owner of the machine. We cry shame on the feudal baron who forbade the peasant to turn a clod of earthquakes unless they surrendered to his lord a fourth of his crop. We called those the barbarous the barbarous times. But if the forms have changed, the relations have remained the same, and the worker is forced, under the name of free contract, to accept feudal obligations for turn where he will. He can find no better conditions. Everything has become private property, and he must accept or die of hunger. The result of this state of things is that all our production tends in a wrong direction. Enterprise takes no thought for their needs in the community. Its only aim is to increase its gain of the speculator. Hence the constant fluctuations of trade and the periodical industrial crises, each of which throws scores of thousands of workers on the streets. The working people cannot purchase with their wages the wealth which they have produced, and the industry he seeks foreign markets among the moneyed classes of other nations. In the East, in Africa, everywhere, in Egypt, Tonkin, in the Congo, or the Congo, the Europeans is thus bound to promote the growth of serfdom. And so he does, but soon he finds that everywhere there are similar competitors. All the nations evolved on the same lines, and perpetual wars, break out for their right precedence in the market. Wars of possession of the East, wars for the empire of the sea, wars to impose duties on imports and to dictate conditions to neighboring states, wars against those blacks who revolt. The roar of Canaan never ceased in the world, whole races are massacred. The states of Europe spend a third of their budgets in armaments, and we know how heavily these taxes fall on the workers. Education still remains the privilege of a small minority, for it's idle to talk of education when the workman's child is forced at the age of 13 to go down to the mine or to help the father on the farm. It is idle to talk of studying to the workers who come home in the evening wearied and excessive toil and its brutalizing atmosphere. Society is thus bound to remain divided into two hostile camps, and in such conditions freedom is a vain word. The radical begins by demanding a greater extension of political rights, but he soon sees that the breath of liberty leads to the uplifting of the proletariat, and then he turns round, changes his opinions, and reverts back to repressive legislation and government by the sword. A vast array of courts, judges, executioners, policemen, and gaolers is needed to uphold these privileges, and by this array gives in its returns a whole system of espionage or false witness, of spies, of threats, and corruption. The system under which we lived checked in its turn the growth of the social sentiment. We all know that without uprightness, without self-respect, without sympathy and mutual aid, humankind must perish, as perish the few races of animals living by rapine, or the slave-keeping ants. But such ideas are not to the taste of the ruling classes, and they have elaborated a whole system of pseudoscience to teach them the contrary. Fine sermons have been preached on the text that those who should have shared with those who have not, but he who would carry out this principle would be speedily informed that these beautiful sentiments are all very well in poetry, but not in practice. Quote, to lie it is to degrade the best merch oneself, unquote, we say. And yet, all civilized life becomes a huge lie. We accustom ourselves and our children to hypocrisy and to participate of a double-faced mortality. And since the brain is ill and ease among lies, we cheat ourselves with sophistry. Hypocrisy and sophistry become the second nature of the civil man. But a society cannot live thus. It must return to the truth or cease to exist. Thus, the consequences of which spring from the original act of monopoly spread through the whole of social life. Under the pain of death, under societies are forced to return to first principles, the means of production being the collective work of humanity. The product should be the collective property of the race. Individual appropriation is neither just nor serviceable. All belongs to all. All things are for all men, since all men have need for them, since all men have worked for the measure of their strength to produce them, and since it is not possible to evaluate everyone's part in the production of the world's wealth, all things for all. Here is an immense stock of tools and implements. Here is all those iron slaves which we call machines, which saw a plane spin and weave for us, unmaking and remaking, working up raw material to produce in the revels of our time. But nobody has the right to seize a single one of these machines and say, "This is mine. If you want to use it, you must pay me a tax on each of your products." Any more than a feudal lord of medieval times had the right to say to the peasant, "This hill, this meadow belong to me, and you must pay me a tax on every sheaf of corn you reap, on every brick you build. All is for all. If the man and women bear their fair share of work, they have a right to their fair share for all that is produced by all, and that share is nothing to secure them well-being. No more of such vague formulas as the right to work or to each the result of his labor. What we proclaim is the rights to well-being for all.